The taste of copper filled my mouth before I understood I was awake. My tongue felt thick, my lips cracked, and somewhere above me a machine was beeping in a rhythm that didn't match my heart. I tried to move my fingers and felt the IV pull at the back of my hand. The light through my eyelids was the flat, dead white of fluorescent tubes. A hospital. I was in a hospital. The last thing I remembered was the road, the headlights coming too fast across the center line on Route 9, the way my husband had been driving with one hand while he scrolled through something on his phone, and the that sound when the truck hit us. After that, nothing. A black curtain. I almost opened my eyes. I almost called out. But before I could, I felt a hand close around my wrist, warm and firm, and a voice I knew better than my own breath leaned in close to my ear. "Don't," my mother whispered. "Don't open your eyes. Don't move. Whatever you do, baby, keep pretending you're still under. I'll explain later. Just trust me." I have never in my life been more confused. But I trusted my mother. She raised me alone after my father walked out when I was 7. She worked the breakfast shift at a diner and then cleaned offices at night so I could go to a real college instead of the community campus where everybody I'd grown up with ended up. When my mother told me to do something with that particular flatness in her voice, the voice she used when the rent was late and she didn't want me to worry, I listened. So I lay there. I made my breathing slow and even. I let my hand go limp under hers. And then I heard the door. Footsteps came in, more than one set, and I recognized them the way you recognize the weather. My husband's heavy, confident stride, his mother's quick little clicks, and the slow, deliberate shuffle of his uncle, the one who walked with the cane after his hip replacement and never let anyone forget it. "Still out," my husband said. He didn't sound worried. He sounded like a man checking on a delayed package. "Doctor says the swelling on the brain hasn't gone down. Could be days, could be longer, or it could be never," his mother said, and there was something in her voice that made the hair on my arm stand up. Hope. She sounded hopeful. I kept my face slack. I kept breathing. Inside my chest, my heart was slamming so hard I was sure they could see it on the monitor, but the beeping stayed steady and nobody said anything about it. "You need to be careful," the uncle said. "If she comes out of this and she remembers the car, if she remembers you reaching over." "I didn't do anything," my husband said quickly, too quickly. "I'm just saying. The lawyer says the policy pays out clean if it's ruled an accident. $2 million on the term life, plus the house plus whatever's left in her accounts. But if there's any question at all, it gets frozen for years. So you need her to stay exactly like this, or you need her to wake up not remembering. Those are the good outcomes." I want to tell you I felt rage in that moment. I didn't. What I felt was cold. A cold that started in my stomach and spread out through my whole body until even my fingertips went numb. $2 million on a term life policy. I didn't have a term life policy. I had never signed up for one. I was 29 years old and I worked as a pediatric nurse, and the idea of life insurance had felt about as urgent as estate planning. But somebody had taken one out, in my name, for $2 million. And my husband was standing 3 feet from my bed talking about how convenient it would be if I never woke up. "Lower your voice," his mother hissed. "Her mother's right outside. She doesn't suspect anything," my husband said. "She thinks I'm the grieving husband. Honestly, the way she's been clinging to me, it's almost embarrassing." My mother, right outside. Except she wasn't outside. She was sitting in the chair beside my bed with her hand on my wrist, and she had told me to play dead. She knew. Somehow, my mother already knew. They talked for a few more minutes. About the funeral home his mother had already, God help me, started getting quotes from. About a woman named Bree, who I gathered was someone my husband had been seeing and who his mother liked very much, and who understood the family in a way I apparently never had. About the timeline. About being patient. And then they left. The door clicked shut, and I lay there in the silence with my eyes closed, and I felt my mother's grit tighten on my wrist. "They're gone," she whispered. "But keep your eyes closed a minute more. There's a camera in the corner. I don't know who's watching." I kept them closed. A tear slid out anyway, ran down the side of my face into my ear, and I didn't dare wipe it. "How did you know?" I breathed. My voice was barely sound. "Because 3 days ago, before the accident, I found the policy," she said. "I was at your house watering your plants like you asked, and the mail came, and there was a statement from the insurance company, premium notice. $2 million, beneficiary, your husband. I almost called you. I wish to God I'd called you. But I thought maybe you knew. Maybe it was something you two had decided together. And then the hospital called me and said you'd been in a wreck, and I knew. The second I heard, I knew. The second I let that settle into me. My husband of 3 years, the man I'd cried with when his father died, the man whose hand I'd held through his vasectomy consult because he was scared of the needle. He had taken out a policy on my life and then driven my car into oncoming traffic on a dark county road, and his only regret was that I hadn't had the decency to die on impact. "Okay," I whispered. "Okay, Mom, listen to me. I need you to do exactly what I say." There was a long pause. Then, very quietly, my mother said, "That's my girl." What they didn't know, what my husband had never once bothered to ask about in 3 years of marriage because he found my work boring, was that I didn't just push pills and take blood pressures. Before I'd gone into pediatrics, I'd spent 2 years in the level 1 trauma unit. I knew exactly what a real brain injury looked like and exactly what it didn't. I knew which neurological tests they'd run and roughly what the results had to be for me to actually have the swelling he was banking on. And I knew, lying there cataloging my own body, that I had a concussion and a broken collarbone and some cracked ribs. And a whole lot of road rash, but my brain was fine. I could wiggle my toes. I could feel the sheet under both heels. I knew what day it was and who the president was and the name of every cranial nerve in order. I wasn't dying. He just needed everyone to believe I might, so we let him believe it. Over the next 2 days, I became the best actress in the state of Ohio. When the nurses came to do their checks, I let my mother quietly intercept them in the hall first, and she fed them a careful version of the truth that the family was under suspicion, that her daughter was frightened, that please, for the love of God, could they not write anything specific about responsiveness in the chart where the husband might see it? Nurses talk to each other. Word moves fast, and it turns out that the women who work the night shift on a neuro floor have seen a lot of bad husbands, and they close ranks faster than you would believe. My charge nurse, a woman who'd been doing this for 30 years, came in on the second night, checked that the door was shut, leaned over me, and said, "Honey, your pupils are perfect, and your reflexes are textbook, and I have written exactly none of that down. You blink twice, if you understand me." I blinked twice. "Good," she said. "Now here's what you're going to do." It was her idea to get the hospital social worker involved, and the social worker's idea to loop in the detective, quietly, through a side door, on a shift change. I lay in that bed with my eyes shut and listened to a detective from the county investigative unit pull a chair up beside me and tell me in a low, calm voice that they'd already pulled the crash report and something about it had bothered the responding officer from the start. The angle of impact. The fact that my husband had walked away with a sprained wrist and a cut on his forehead while my side of the car was crushed nearly into the console. The fact that he'd been able to get his own seatbelt off and get clear before the car, and I won't go into the rest. But it had been a close thing for me, closer than my husband had probably planned. "Here's what I need to know," the detective said. "And blink for yes, 2 for no. Did you take out a life insurance policy on yourself?" 2 blinks. "Did you authorize anyone to take one out on you?" 2 blinks. "Have you ever discussed leaving your husband?" I almost laughed. 1 blink. "Were you afraid of him before the accident?" I lay there for a long moment. Because the honest answer was complicated, I hadn't been afraid of him the way you'd think. He'd never hit me. He'd never raised his voice in any way the neighbors would have heard. What he'd done was smaller and slower. He'd convinced me, over 3 years, that my friends didn't really like me, that my judgment was bad, that I overreacted, that the reason we never had money despite both of us working was that I spent too much. When the truth, which I learned later, was that he'd been quietly draining our joint account into his mother's name for 2 years. He'd made me small in 100 quiet ways until being married to him felt like living in a house with the ceiling slowly coming down, so gradually you don't notice you're already crouching. One blink. Yes, I had been afraid. Okay, the detective said. We're going to get you out of here, but I need you to keep doing what you're doing for a little while longer. Can you do that? One blink. The hardest part wasn't the pretending. The hardest part wasn't the pretending. The hardest part was the visits. My husband came every day, and he played his role beautifully, and I lay there and absorbed it. He held my limp hand and told the empty room how much he loved me, how he didn't know what he'd do without me, how he prayed every night for me to come back to him. His voice would crack exactly the right moments. Once, his mother came with him, and the two of them stood at the foot of my bed and discussed, in low murmurs they thought I couldn't hear, whether it would look suspicious to pull the breathing support too soon. I wasn't even on breathing support. But they'd convinced themselves I was failing, and whether Bree could come to the funeral, or whether that would be too much. I lay there and I memorized all of it, every word, because I knew, by then, that there was a recorder in the room. The detective had put it there, 2 cameras and a recorder, running around the clock, capturing every tender word my husband whispered and every poisonous thing he said when he thought love had left the room. On the 5th day, I woke up. I don't mean I actually woke up. I don't mean I actually woke up. I'd been awake the whole time. I mean we staged it. The detective wanted him in the room when it happened, and he wanted witnesses who weren't part of the family, so it was arranged that I would regain consciousness during morning rounds, with the attending physician present, with my charge nurse present, with the social worker conveniently nearby, and with 2 plainclothes officers standing in the hall. My husband was sitting beside the bed, scrolling on his phone, when I let my eyes flutter open for the first time in front of him. "Hey," I said, and my voice came out as a rasp. "Hey, where am I?" You should have seen his face. For 1/10 of 1 second before he caught himself, I watched something cross it that I will remember until the day I die. It wasn't joy. It wasn't relief. It was disappointment. The plain, naked disappointment of a man who has just watched a winning lottery ticket blow out of his hand. And then the mask came down and he grabbed my hand and his eyes filled with tears and he said, "Oh my God. Oh my God, you're awake. Baby, you came back to me." And I want you to understand that he is a genuinely talented liar, because if I hadn't heard every word he'd said in that room over 5 days, I would have believed him completely. I would have squeezed his hand back. Instead, I looked up at the doctor and I said, very clearly, in front of everyone, I remember the accident. I remember him reaching across me right before the truck hit. I remember the policy I never signed, and I've been awake the whole time. I have never heard a room go so quiet. The detective came in from the hallway. My husband stood up so fast his chair went over backward. His mother, who had just arrived and was standing in the doorway with a coffee, dropped the cup. And the officers were already moving, and one of them was reading him his rights, and through all of it my husband kept looking at me with this expression of pure betrayal, like I was the one who'd done something unforgivable. "You were faking," he said. "Of all the things to say, you lying, you were faking the whole time." "Yeah," I said. "I learned from the best. The trial took 8 months. I won't pretend it was easy. There were days I sat in that courtroom and listened to my own husband's lawyer suggest that I'd staged my own near murder for attention, that I was a vindictive woman, that the recordings were taken out of context. But there is no context in which we need her to stay exactly like this or wake up not remembering means something innocent. The recordings did most of the work. His own mother took a plea deal and testified against him to save herself, which I found fitting because she'd spent 3 years telling him I wasn't good enough for the family. The insurance policy turned out to have been forged with my signature traced off our marriage license. The financial records show the slow bleed of our accounts into his mother's name. The woman named Bree, it turned out, had no idea he was married when they met, and when she found out the truth, she handed her phone full of his messages straight to the prosecution. He's serving 22 years. His mother got 5. The uncle, who only knew and said nothing, wasn't charged with anything, but he doesn't get to see his nephew much anymore, and I'm told he tells people at his church that the whole thing was a misunderstanding, that I'm a manipulative girl who tore a good family apart. He goes to the same church my husband and I were married in. The pastor who married us came to visit me once, after the verdict, and sat in my mother's kitchen and apologized to me and told me he'd struggled with how a man he'd counseled, a man he'd believed loved God, could do what he'd done. I didn't have an answer for him. I still don't. That's the part nobody warns you about. People kept telling me afterward that I must feel so vindicated, so victorious, and I did, a little, but mostly what I felt for a long time was stupid. Stupid for not seeing it, stupid for explaining away every red flag, stupid for believing that the small voice in the back of my head that had been whispering something is wrong here for 3 years was just my own anxiety, my own inability to be happy, exactly like he'd trained me to believe. It took me almost a year of therapy to understand that I wasn't stupid. I was loved badly by someone who was very good at making it look like love. There's a difference. And the only reason I'm alive to tell you any of this is that my mother watered my plants on the wrong Tuesday and opened the wrong piece of mail and trusted the cold feeling in her gut over the comfortable lie that everything was fine. I moved back in with her for a while after 2 grown women in a little 2-bedroom rental, the way it had been when I was a kid, except now I was the one who could pay the rent. I went back to nursing eventually, though I switched to a hospital across the state where nobody knew the story. I kept my own name well, my mother's name, my maiden name, which I took back the day the divorce was final, 2 days before the criminal trial even started. I don't wear a ring. I sleep with the bedroom door locked, still, 3 years later, and I've stopped apologizing for it. People ask me sometimes when the story comes up if I knew, if some part of me knew before that day in the hospital. And I think about the cold that spread through my body when I heard the words $2 million, how it wasn't shock so much as confirmation, how my body had been bracing for something for a long time. I think a part of me always knew. I think a part of you always does. The thing I hold on to, the thing that gets me through the nights when I wake up at 3 a.m., with my heart pounding from a dream about headlights, is the memory of my mother's hand on my wrist in that hospital room. The way she leaned down and told me to keep my eyes closed and trust her. She'd worked 2 jobs to give me a life, and when that life turned out to be built on a lie, she was the one who pulled me out of the wreckage. Not the man who promised to love me until death did us part. He just got the death part wrong. I keep her phone number written on a card in my wallet, even though I know it by heart, even though she lives 20 minutes away now, and I see her every Sunday. I don't know why exactly. I think it's because there was a moment, lying in that bed, when I understood with total clarity who in this world would burn it all down to keep me breathing and who would light the match. Everybody should know that, before it's too late. I just wish I hadn't had to learn it the way I did. For a long time after the verdict, I kept circling back to one small thing, the wrong Tuesday. My mother watered my plants on a day she wasn't supposed to, opened a piece of mail that wasn't hers, and refused to talk herself out of the cold feeling in her stomach. That's the whole reason I'm here. Not luck, exactly. She paid attention when something felt off, and she had the spine to act on it instead of choosing the easy comfort of believing everything was fine. Everything that happened after, the recordings, the trial, the 22 years, all of it grew out of that one honest moment. I think about my husband the same way, just in reverse. He didn't wake up one morning a monster. He got there one small lie at a time, draining the accounts a little, making me doubt myself a little, telling himself a little story about how he deserved more than the life we had. Every choice made the next one easier until reaching across the seat on a dark road felt like math instead of murder. Nobody falls that far in a single step. You walk there, quietly, in the dark, telling yourself it's not what it is. What pulled me out of that bed wasn't rage. It was the steadiness I'd learned in a trauma unit nobody bothered to ask me about. The part of me that could lie still and count cranial nerves while my marriage burned. I want anyone listening to understand that your mind is not decoration. The thing he found boring about me, my work, my training, my quiet competence, was the exact thing that saved my life. Learn things deeply. Pay attention to the unglamorous skills. You never know which one will be the difference between being a victim and being a witness. And learn to sit in something hard without falling apart because the pretending was brutal. 5 days of holding my husband's hand while he rehearsed my funeral. I got through it one breath at a time. and that endurance was a muscle, not a gift. It got stronger because I used it. But the part I'd carve into stone if I could is this. When the lottery ticket blew out of his hand and he looked at me with disappointment instead of joy, I finally understood the difference between someone who loves you and someone who is good at performing it. Be the kind of person who keeps their word when the room goes quiet, when nobody's recording, when no one would ever know. My husband was decent only when he had an audience. My mother was decent on a wrong Tuesday with nobody watching. That gap is everything. Build your life so that if a hidden microphone caught your most private moment, you'd have nothing to be ashamed of. I learned that lesson lying in a bed, pretending to be gone, listening to the two of them divide my life between them. I hope you learn it somewhere gentler than I did.